It's my privilege to introduce you to Erika Shaker and Robin Shaban. I had the great privilege of working as the director of the Saskatchewan office of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives during the early 2000s. Erika joined CCPA in 1997 during an era when very little attention was paid to the organization by the national media. If a CCPA report made it to a newscast, it was usually referenced in a dismissive and often somewhat derogatory manner, according to the left-wing think tank, the CCPA. Well, Erika was a key member of the team that worked relentlessly over the years to establish the CCPA's credibility through rigorous but highly accessible research that is skillfully communicated to the media. Taking research out of the ivory tower and using it to arm activists with the information they need to create change. Now, on almost every critical issue, public policy issue, the CCPA is one of the first organizations the media turns to get a reaction. The CCPA has always been a champion for community campus collaboration, leading national conversations on many of the complex social issues that we're going to be discussing throughout our 2 days together. Internationally best-selling author, journalist, and activist Naomi Klein says this about the CCPA. We need the CCPA to remind us that our dreams of a decent, egalitarian society are reasonable. Indeed, that with a little work, they are practical. And I love that practicality, that protection of the dream of the possible. Now, Robin Shaban is an independent economic and public policy consultant based in Ottawa that has worked in collaboration with Erika and the CCPA on a number of projects. And she is also a regular contributor to the CCPA's national publication, The Monitor. Together, these two women form a formidable team, and I'm so delighted to turn the floor over to them now to share their thoughts on ways researchers and community activists can work together to have greater collective impact through their work.
Hello, everyone. Robin and I join you today from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. It is a pleasure to be with you, and it is also a pleasure to have been invited to join you today by my good friend and former colleague, Lynn Gidlock, who I luckily had the opportunity to see and make pierogies with in the before times, and who I miss very much. Lynn gave a quick synopsis of the CCPA. I'm going to just give you a few more details. We are described as one of Canada's leading progressive think tanks. We are independent. We have charitable status. We focus on economic and social policy issues. We were founded in 1980 as a sort of project between academics and labor researchers, but have grown significantly. In addition to the founding office in Ottawa, which is the one I direct, we have offices in Vancouver, Regina, Winnipeg, Toronto, and Halifax. While we have engaged in SSHRC-funded research, we are not government funded. The majority of our money, our funding, comes from our individual supporters. In addition to our policy analysis, we do extensive work with civil society organizations and are committed to accessible communication, dissemination, and knowledge translation.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. Like Lynn said, my name is Robin Shaban, and I am the senior economist and co-founder of Vivic Research, which is a social enterprise. Our core goal at Vivic is to provide economic consulting services to community organizations that are underserved by the traditional discipline of economics. Economists don't typically get training in how to do human-centered research that truly considers people. In fact, mainstream economics is often used to or supports systems of oppression that undermine communities. In that way, Vivic is a critique of traditional economics, and we strive to show people that economics can be done differently. So when we do community-based research, we are approaching this work as activists. Erika and I first met when I applied to be an intern at CCPA about 5 years ago. I had graduated from my master's in economics 3 years prior and was working my way out of a crisis of faith. I had left my first real job as an economist in the government feeling empty and frankly, somewhat disgusted. in the real life practice of economics, I saw utter apathy towards the most vulnerable people in our society. After contemplating leaving the discipline altogether, I decided to instead try and find a way to do economics in a way that respected and honored people, rather than treating them as merely economic objects. My time at CCPA was transformational, and it opened the door to collaborate with Erika and ultimately the work that I do today.
Lynn actually outed me by saying when I started at the CCPA, I was just going to euphemistically refer to it as longer ago than I care to admit. After finishing my MA with a focus on critical literary theory, but with a professional and a personal focus on public education and social justice work in the broader context of the rising corporate onslaught. But education is, of course, provincially based. And because so much of the work in defense of it was being done on the ground, I also very quickly became immersed in local community needs and initiatives. For me, it was a crash course in the perpetual tension between universal programs and their necessarily massive infrastructure and bureaucracy, to the immediacy and variation of community-based needs, particularly marginalized communities. 3, the growing distance between the two, often fueled by or reinforced by cutbacks and downsizing and the rise of precarity. And 4, elected representatives who contribute to and then weaponize this disconnect. Of course, the current context of a global pandemic is very relevant here. And while COVID hasn't changed everything, it's revealed and underscored a number of inconvenient truths about our society, including how we work or don't work together. Simply put, there can be no back to normal because for some of the most marginalized communities, normal was already untenable. Normal meant inadequate, unsupported, exclusion, violence. If we are truly working together as allies, privileged progressives, and we are extremely privileged, need to be prepared to engage authentically in the processes and research required to help ensure a just recovery from COVID and from the systemic inequities that have been inconvenient for some, but devastating for others. And this has impacted how we do our work and the need to be much clearer and more honest about ourselves and our responsibilities to and within civil society. Irrefutable research done even with the best of intentions is no longer enough. This also means we cannot afford the luxury of defensiveness. We need to be prepared to hear sometimes harsh criticism from communities we have considered ourselves allies to, and then use it to change how we work together. I'm gonna actually apologize. I can control some of the background noise of my kids doing their remote schooling. I can't control the people next door who are cutting paving stones. So I apologize in advance, and I will do my best to turn my mic off when it gets a little bit too messy.
Your audio is very clean.
Okay, perfect. That's great. Thank you. As an independent research organization with charitable status, the CCPA is at that nexus of policy and analysis and civil society. And as a result, we find ourselves constantly having to examine our role and our responsibility as a research organization, as a third-party validator, and as an ally. This means we provide capacity in a number of ways. We convene groups across civil society, we offer support as policy and communication specialists, and also to identify where we can make a contribution in support of allies and to broaden the debate on key issue areas. But given our independent status and the interests of allyship, it means we have to always reevaluate not just the role we can play, but the role we need to play.
In preparing for this talk, we got the opportunity to really test a lot of what we take for granted as a researcher and an economist, but also as members of various communities and as two people committed to civil society engagement. As is generally the case when conducting research, we went broad and then found ourselves focusing more specifically on 3 key concepts: identifying policy gaps and needs, a recognition of our responsibilities and limits in facilitating and enhancing community engagement in the broader civil society debate, and then lastly, ongoing awareness of the power dynamics in how research is conducted and used. Today, we'll spend a bit of time exploring each theme by drawing on examples from our work, some of which we did together, some of which we've done separately. And we'll take some time to talk specifically about my work at Vivic Research as a tangible example of how these principles of community research and collaboration have been operationalized in our social enterprise.
I'm going to start with our annual childcare survey, which is a key piece at the CCPA of our strategic research agenda, and we get a lot of attention for it. It began in 2014 with 22 cities. By 2020, it was collecting fee data in 37 cities, including at least one city in every province and territory. The methodology of the phone survey is designed to produce statistically valid estimates of median childcare fees weighted by spaces. And in 2020, the last one we just did, this meant hiring 4 surveyors to make 12,000 phone calls over 2 months to ensure required coverage rates. Representing 52% of all licensed spaces in Canada, this is the only cross-Canada multi-year data set on licensed childcare fees. And it's now used by various organizations, including Statistics Canada, the International Monetary Fund, and the federal budget as the authoritative source of childcare fee data in Canada. But how it came about is useful to this conversation. In our work at the CCPA over the previous decade, much of which I was also involved in with the childcare community, policy and advocacy groups, we identified there was a lack of data, specifically the amount parents were paying in fees. We also knew from our experience as a think tank working closely with civil society movements that in order to generate mainstream attention, the method of presenting data would be extremely important. So we had to consider the data we obtained and how to present it to most effectively support advocates by providing irrefutable numbers, helping to frame the debate for the public, and engaging with policymakers as experts, but in a way that didn't then inadvertently undermine advocates on the ground who had their own strategies. We also had to think of this as an ongoing source of support and not just a one-off media hit. So we focused on creating infrastructure to help build capacity within the movement. The annual process from data gathering to expert analysis to collaboration and consultation across the sector means that the survey is also an effective vehicle to collect information in pretty much in real time. For example, we were able to look at lowered enrollment during COVID, the relationship to fees, and if closures occur as a result of reduced enrollment, the implications for there being sufficient spaces once reopening happens. We also wanted to make sure that the discussion of fees was going to be helpful in the context of a progressive model for childcare in Canada. So we wanted to make sure our research became indispensable to not just allies and advocates, but policymakers too, which it did. In fact, our numbers just appeared with credit, which is shocking, in this year's federal budget as part of the rationale for a national childcare strategy. So to summarize, from our position as a policy think tank, we identified a gap in existing data and how the childcare debates would benefit from having that gap addressed. We recognized we had sufficient internal capacity to make an important contribution. We worked extremely closely with childcare advocates to ensure the analysis was properly contextualized and presented in a manner that reflected the work being done on the ground, because there is so much provincial and even local variation that it can be obscured by just taking a national overview. And because there was bound to be unpredictable trial and error, it also required building and maintaining good relationships with allies and grassroots organizations so that we could, through very honest and open conversations, continue to improve on the analysis, anticipate how it was going to be used, and then respond to hostile pushback from organizations or governments. And this was particularly important in the context of COVID, because we knew that certain provincial governments were unlikely to invest in childcare given their clear prioritization of austerity budgeting. So how do you point to high levels of provincial government involvement in childcare and keeping fees low, which of course makes it more accessible to far more families, knowing that some more conservative governments are going to use our data as an excuse to cut funding by saying that it's high time those fees increased because they've already done their bit. How do we talk about the connection between high fees and parents pulling their kids out of daycare in the context of having their own work and wages impacted by the pandemic, while fending off the predictable right-wing retort that COVID has just proven we don't need childcare, we just need to pay more moms to stay home? So these are some of the things that we had to work through.
I'm now going to turn to another project where Erika and I have worked together. It was the first time Erika and I collaborated, and the analysis was a Ontario-focused analysis of precarity in the university and college sector. It was commissioned by organizations representing workers, but the purpose was to provide data to underpin and explain the realities of those workers. The strategy was twofold: to determine what data was available to the most thoughtful way to disaggregate it, and then to uncover how university and college employees, some of whom were also students, were experiencing the rise of casualized labor in very personal terms. So I took the lead in determining what data from the labor force survey would be helpful to unpack these questions. When we began we then began a fairly long and involved process with Statistics Canada to access the data, determining the extent to which that data were helpful, and then reiterating on that data request, which made the process much longer, but ultimately resulted in a better, more accurate and usable data set to work with. It also resulted in us having to develop a solid working relationship with two analysts at StatCan, both named Andrew, or as we called them, StatCandrew 1 and StatCandrew 2. But this raises another point, the need to be familiar with the complexities and challenges of procuring good data, which can be yet another roadblock for communities trying to do their own research that we can help navigate as researchers. Going into the analysis, we and our partners had the expectation or hypothesis that post-secondary jobs across the board were becoming more precarious. What the data told us, however, was that there were more complex dynamics at play. Precarity was driven by a relative increase in inherently precarious work, like research teaching assistants, alongside a relative decrease in non-precarious work, like librarians, professors, and instructors. These trends were happening alongside a rise in precarious work in jobs related to plant operations, administration, and college academic staff. Pulling out the trends in the data was complex, and we had to apply a lot of effort to ensure that we effectively communicated that complexity to the research partners. The process of making sense of the data forced us to reevaluate the premise of our research question, which probably isn't an unfamiliar experience for most academic researchers who take a more inductive approach to analysis. But in the context of community research, what can be really challenging is having to go back to the drawing board when the research needs to be done quickly and when there are community members with a strong interest in the research outcomes. So building in time for reevaluation and making community members aware of the potential uncertainties of the research project is a requirement at the outset. For us, the rethinking process also forced us to get clear on the actual problem we were trying to identify and whether what we were aiming to measure was the problem itself or the symptom of the problem. Again, building in time to do these reevaluations and to ensure the groups that we are working with are part of that process was very important. But, and this is key, the intent of our research was not only to quantify the scope of precarity and its relative increase or decrease. It was also to try and get at the impact of precarity on workers who experienced it and on their ability to do their jobs. To that end, we included a mechanism, a survey, to fold these voices and perspectives into our own final report. Numbers, yes, but voices too, because what our analysis demonstrated was that not everyone experiences precarity the same way or to the same extent. But for those that do experience precarity, it can be devastating. In our commitment as researchers to the precise use of the data, the analysis should not be used to mute or obfuscate their experiences, but rather underscore them. So when we conducted our advanced media work leading up to the release of the report, the primary focus was on the individuals, and that's what led in the coverage, with the numbers playing a necessary but supporting role.
Robin and I are both going to talk a little bit about the alternative budgeting model. I'm going to start talking about the alternative federal budget, which is an interesting model of community research. And not only because it was our very first opportunity for the CCPA to work with Robin as our progressive economics intern. The AFB comes out of a proud participatory budgeting initiative and was taken up by the CCPA in collaboration with the Manitoba-based Choices group in 1995. This was in response to the infamous Paul Martin budget that was responsible for massive cuts to social programs, really sort of a watershed moment. The AFB was premised on the notion that budgets are about choices, and even from within the government's own very narrow parameters, we can make different decisions about how to get to balance without treating families, communities, and social programs as regrettable but necessary casualties of slaying the deficit. The AFB has come to play a number of roles. It's an educational exercise in popular budgeting. It's an alternative list of proposals representing dozens of civil society groups, sort of like a people's budget, an opportunity to make a comprehensive progressive intervention in the budget cycle. And it's a value add from progressive economists who can lend their expertise, their number crunching, costing out policy asks to community groups who may just not have that internal capacity. The online platform, which goes along with the alternative budget, has also become a policy aggregator where we post and promote the various responses to the federal budget, the actual federal budget, from the members of the steering committee, which include unions, advocacy organizations, researchers, academics, and community groups right across the country. The platform and the initiative became even more significant with COVID, when we sort of repurposed the alternative federal budget network and platform as a recovery plan for 2020, and used it to and put our growing public profile, because of the work we've been doing and reevaluating income supports, to work in service of our community and our labor allies. As I said, this is a somewhat different model of community research. It's more about how we use our internal resources, our profile, and our capacity to support civil society research that often forms the basis of the advocacy work of our partners. It's also a slightly different model in the sense that while the CCPA does the macroeconomic section, make sure the numbers add up or apply numbers where we're asked to, much of the policy content is produced by the civil society organizations around the now virtual table, which we then fold into our broader media strategy. What's built into the process is the recognition that some of the communities we work with throughout the AFB process have very little capacity to make large-scale federal policy asks without this existing platform, without the CCPA's internal capacity to do fiscal analysis, and without an established production process and media outreach strategy. So it also supports these own individual advocacy efforts by providing background context and, where necessary, numbers, because we cost out these asks to back them up. And because civil society engagement is always a work in progress, we continued to rework our format to make it less onerous for some of these smaller organizations to engage, including hiring an intern. Robin was the first one, but we've done this every year to help to help coordinate meetings and support contributors, and then helping to produce accessible tools for civil society organizations' own outreach needs, because of course, they do their own work as well, and the AFB sort of provides a major resource to help facilitate and enable that.
Likewise, Vivic's work with the Ottawa Coalition for a People's Budget, which is another alternative budget project for the city of Ottawa, really highlighted the importance of bringing adequate capacity to community research projects, both in terms of number crunching fiscal analysis skills, but also organizational capacity. So for this project, the community we were serving was looking for two main things from us: project management and budget calculations. And the project management was the biggest consideration. As a coalition of nonprofits, many of which are volunteer-led, they needed a research team that was autonomous and could make a timeline and stick to it. Our expertise in developing and costing new programs for the budget was important, but secondary. The coalition could have put together a compelling report without the math. What they couldn't live without was a team of supportive researchers that was organized, understood the project, and followed through on the tasks they said they were going to do. The project wasn't about Vivic doing the work as an external validated consultant, like is the case with most hired economic consulting. While some clients get a lot of value out of having a third-party validator, so to speak, prepare a report for them, I'm discovering that these clients tend to be the minority. In fact, I'm finding that the clients that get the most value out of having an external validator are typically more privileged and are engaging directly with governments and other officials. For a lot of community orgs, outside validation is important, but what's actually more important is having their voices heard. So as researchers, Vivic's primary job is to provide the capacity communities need to make their voices heard, not to make an argument or an assessment on their behalf. So to recap, with the alternative budget for the City of Ottawa, capacity was really key. And this wasn't just about research capacity, but organizational and coordination capacity. Furthermore, while some organizations may be looking for outside expertise in a certain area, oftentimes the core need of the community is having their voice heard. In these cases, grabbing the podium or megaphone as an expert validator, even with the best intentions, can do more harm than good. The academic expert role must be carefully defined and well understood in advance. I now want to turn to another Vivic project we're currently wrapping up with 613-819 Black Hub, which is an advocacy organization coordinating volunteer-led efforts to address anti-Black racism in the Ottawa region. We are working with them right now to undertake a community-wide consultation to put forward a new vision for mental health intervention strategy based on compassion, not cops. What I think is most relevant about this project is not only the process of identifying policy gaps and needs, but also the role of power dynamics in how research is conducted and used. So the hub came to us with a pretty clear idea of what support they needed. Their goal was to put together an alternative community-made strategy that could preempt a strategy currently being developed by the city's police. From that launching point, we put together a more detailed research proposal and established timelines for the project. For this project, timing is critical because we want to get the strategy into the hands of the public before the police and their allies at City Hall push their solution to the public. Unsurprisingly, power and power dynamics are a major undercurrent of the research. And undoubtedly, Vivic will leave this project with a better sense of how to be an effective ally to communities that are marginalized and brutalized by the police and other institutions. But going into the work, we thought a lot about our role. We decided to position ourselves more as facilitators of the community rather than as external economist researchers. This mindset shaped our research approach, which was centered around a consultation process with community organizations rather than a more academic research methods like literature reviews and data analysis, although we have integrated elements of that into the project as well. This approach also meant that we have relied really heavily on the expertise of the community to put forward the final strategy. The project also raised questions about whose voices should lead when it comes to community initiatives like this, back to this power theme. Because we sought to consult with every community organization that could have a stake in the final policy proposal, we faced the unavoidable problem of conflicting perspectives in the community. Given our primary role as facilitators, we aim to find ways to reconcile these diverse views in the research rather than challenge them. But in other projects we have done, it's sometimes more appropriate for us to take more of a leadership role in shaping the final policy proposal and guiding the client in that direction. Like I discussed before, the times when we offer this sort of direct guidance is when the client is looking for a more external validator. But for this project, the core goal is to have the community's voice heard, not to have it validated by some economic consultants that lack lived experience. So in sum, the key takeaways for me when it comes to this project with 613-819 Black Hub is that the role of power and power dynamics cannot be understated. These dynamics can not only shape the research itself, but also the research, rather also the relationship that you as a researcher have with the project, and by extension, the research method employed.
So as we mentioned, the global pandemic has served as a sort of X-ray. I have a friend who refers to it as black light, exposing flaws and fissures that those with the luxury of security were often able to ignore or avoid, forget, pretend weren't there, or maybe just afford a workaround. But they remained a tremendous source of frustration, even damage for precarious, marginalized communities. So while we do need to practice care and compassion in recognition of how lives have been upended by the current pandemic, we can no longer expect good intentions and kind words to carry the day. For community research to truly serve the needs of communities, particularly those most marginalized, we have a responsibility to interrogate our assumptions about the role we can play, the role we need to play, and the responsibility we must demonstrate. As Robin and I reflected on these projects we outlined for you today, we had identified 3 key themes that drive and frame our role in understanding community-based research: identifying policy gaps and needs, a recognition of our responsibilities and our limits in facilitating and enhancing community engagement in the broader civil society debate, and ongoing awareness of the power dynamics in how community research is conducted and used, or research that is done in service of the community.
To help clarify what these themes really look like, and in anticipation of the inevitable challenges that will arise, we put together a list of questions that often need to be revisited throughout the research process to ensure that we're still on the same page. To be clear, this is not an exhaustive list. There will be trial and error, which underscores the need to develop authentic relationships with partners. So the first question we pose is, what need are we being asked to meet? Are we being asked to provide capacity, third-party validation, and is the need changing throughout the project? The second question we pose is, on the topic of responsibility, when do we lead and when do we support? And what does leading versus support really look like? Third, what responsibility do we have for how the research will be used? And lastly, where are the check-ins and reevaluations built into the project? At what point in the project are we going to step back and ask, what's the symptom and what's the problem? And how do we ensure authentic community engagement in the reevaluation process? I want to wrap up by saying thank you very much for the opportunity to be here to speak with you today. Erika and I are looking forward to your questions and continuing the discussion.
Thank you so much, Erika and Robin. That was a really interesting and thought-provoking session. I think Professor Andre summed it up very well in his comment, where he said that it's a very fantastic intro to the conference. And the examples that you shared were very timely. And I'm going to turn now to the chat, and there, it looks like we have some questions coming in. From Rebs Lee. Are these 3 questions available online? I can't write fast enough.
We can make our notes available. Not a problem.
And we got someone coming, a comment from George. George, would you like to speak, have the opportunity to speak, or should we read this for you? We can unmute you.
He should be able to do it himself. He looks to the lower left corner. There'll be a slash through the microphone and camera.
There we are. First of all, it's an outstanding presentation. I mean, this is science that the movements desperately need. I've been an activist all my adult life, and I wish I had some of these resources much earlier. I probably wouldn't have made the mistakes that I've made. But one of the things that in now having the time to study economics and political economy, I'm noting that one of the big things we've been fighting is the austerity neoliberal agenda all the way through for about the last 4 decades. Now suddenly the taps are open. Georgieva from the IMF and Joe Biden, suddenly the taps are turned on. And I'm just wondering, do you fold any of that into your research and into your projections? Because so that we don't somehow get led down the garden path, because we also know the conservatives are still they're raising the question of deficits and debts and all this kind of stuff. And are we in a post-Keynesian period, or is this lasting, in your opinion? When you frame your debate on research, do you factor that in?
Robin, why don't you go first?
All right. Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I'm finding increasingly yes. And for me, these considerations, they tend to show up in the more kind of foundational parts of the research. So we're thinking through these concepts when we're actually, scoping out and setting the vision for the project. So for example, I'm working on scoping a project right now with a client that is looking for alternative methods for funding a universal basic income. So what sort of taxes could we implement that would be acceptable to a broad range of people on the political spectrum in order to fund a basic income? And here we are battling head to head with different ideological views of what the economy ought to be. It's the classic austerity versus Keynesian face-off. And we're trying to do a literature review that attempts to reconcile that. And so does that fit into the number crunching we're going to do at the end, the mathematical modeling? No, it doesn't show up there. But where it shows up is how we're actually approaching the research. And yeah, I guess the scope. Another area where this is showing up a lot for me is the work I've been doing on competition law or anti-monopoly law in Canada. There too, like the core of the debate is one of what is the economy? What is the nature of the economy? What are our ideological views of the economy? And the technical aspects kind of, at the end of the day, they're kind of superfluous. So again, I think, yeah, these issues, I'm seeing them show up more and more, and maybe it's because we are seeing greater diversity in economic perspectives now than even 5 years ago. And for me, it really shows up in that foundational work where we're framing, we're setting the goal for the project, and ultimately thinking through the audience. That's another part of it too, thinking through, okay, who's actually going to be reading this? Who do we want to be having a conversation with? And where can we meet them so that we can start a conversation and then bring them along somewhere?
Thank you. I
think, and I would encourage everybody to look at what Robin has done on competition law, because it's brilliant. She's quite brilliant. Yes, actually, it's interesting. I mean, from a number of perspectives, I mentioned earlier that the CCPA is also committed to producing accessible analysis. And Robin's absolutely bang on when she says, really, this is about thinking through the audience. So a number of what we're doing, we did the bigger policy pieces. A major report we did at the very beginning of the year called Picking Up the Tab looked at the degree to which any COVID spending measures were actually paid for by the feds, by the province. Well, the feds, how much of it was federal money, how much of it was federal money that was sort of rebranded or repurposed as provincial money, and then how much money the provinces were actually spending, and whether or not money was being left on the table or not spent at all and sort of just sitting in coffers. And that was done as a first step, first of all, to kind of, really demystify how much money was actually being spent, in large part, because we knew that the next call was going to be for austerity because of all the money that had been spent, right? So we wanted to actually set out a baseline, and then we'll update it, which we're going to be doing. And then we're going to start looking at the degree to which austerity and tax cuts, for example, create recovery drag, right? How much further along would we have been but for this sort of austerity mantra, the tax cuts that go along with it, and this continuous fear of deficits, right? This deficit hysteria. So part of it will be to produce these larger foundational pieces, but then also piercing that rhetoric, that narrative that deficits are bad, as opposed to just recognizing that when deficits and surpluses are kind of two sides of the same thing. To run a deficit here means there's a surplus over here. If the government runs a deficit, it's so people don't actually have to take that on themselves, because if people take it on themselves, some pay far more than others. Some are in a position to pay more than others, and some actually literally take it out of their own lives, their livelihoods, their families, their communities. So also trying to provide that content, right, that accessible content that, yes, does go to folks who are looking for this information, because then they can take it and actually formulate their own arguments and become advocates for a different way of thinking through what we want the economy to look like.
Thank you, Erika and Robin, for that great answer to that question. Or do we have any other questions to pose to our wonderful speakers this morning? Erika, I wonder if you have any advice. This is just coming from me, since I'm seeing nobody coming into the chat here. For the university professors and researchers that are on the line, what's your biggest piece of advice for working with community?
I think recognizing that expertise comes from all sorts of different places, that there is, there's data-driven expertise, but there's also lived expertise as well. And we need to recognize the importance of those working together. That there is not a hierarchy. There are opportunities to identify capacity and contribution, but one can't happen at the expense of the other. If we're going to make progress together, we have to do it together and not at the expense of each other. And we have a lot of work to do when it comes to bridging that chasm that I mentioned earlier about the sort of disillusionment between how things work in the ivory tower and what needs look like on the ground. It's not enough to say we're all on the same side. We all want the same things. We all want to do good. We have to listen. We have to reflect. We have to be humble, and we have to learn.
Great advice. Looks like we've got a question coming in from Nadine Changfoot. Can you see that, Erika?
Nate, I do. Nadine, if you want to email me, I can actually answer that question in much more detail if you are interested. But briefly, my area of focus has always been education. And so I did a tremendous amount of work with the childcare community from that perspective, right? Education and early childhood education, or cradle to grave education, really, because I also focus on post-secondary too. So we had established these relationships and a sort of a relationship of trust across a sector that isn't necessarily always unified, right? There, in part because it is so local. So much and so much of what progress looks like is done on a local level. So what looks like progress in Quebec, for example, is not going to look like what it looks like in BC. And because the system was so fractured to begin with subsidies in some places and more government involvement in others, for example, actually more of a sort of universal government involvement in others. I would say that developing those relationships, that was a good 5 years, just in working through education, early childhood education, and maintaining those relationships through the work we were doing in early childhood in ECE, but then also the broader financial picture as well, the broader economic picture. It came with, I think, recognizing the gap. We spend a lot of time looking at looking at what numbers are missing. And unfortunately, you know, and sifting through what's available through Statistics Canada. And when you identify what StatsCan isn't collecting, you're very lucky when you have a moment when you can say, you know what, we can do this. It's going to take work, but we have the internal capacity to help make this happen. And to actually identify the fact that there is a need and that there is a role that Statistics Canada, for example, could play, or other organizations in actually gathering that data and making it available. We just happen to get to it first. But if you have more details, Nadine, I'm happy to give you more information. I mean, I know that all of our information will be made available through the organizers.
We are quickly coming to the end of our time, and we're supposed to be taking a break before we jump into our regional conversations. But if we can have a short answer to the Manuel or question.
Did you want me to ask, Lynn?
Sure.
Okay. So I just was wondering if you had any reflection on disbursement quota of 3.5%. It's the disbursement quota states that the minimum spending requirements for registered charities and charitable purposes in Canada, right? So 3.5%. And so I was wondering if you had any new policy suggestion on that front.
Not at this moment. I'm sorry. Let me think on that. I can get back to you though. I mean, it's something that we're constantly having to navigate, right? Because things are changing, and because of our limitations as a charity, what we can and can't say, particularly during election season. And, you know, as we move into a federal election, I mean, there's two things. There's the election law, and then there's the CRA requirements as well. So we're constantly having to navigate this, but let me think on that, and let's be in touch. Thank you.
So folks, unfortunately, I think we could sit here and talk with Erika and Robin all day. You know, you've given us so much great food for thought, but we've got a pretty tight schedule. And so we're going to have a 15-minute break.